Good evening, everybody. This is Colleen O'Hara with Pocatello Paranormal Research, and tonight is our podcast, Speaking of Spirits. And with me tonight, we have team members and a broadcaster, Mark Scott. I want to introduce him. I've worked with Mark on and off for the last 10 years, and he specializes in all things dark. So, Mark, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Colleen. As said, my name is Mark Scott, and I have been fascinated, interested, and studying in everything dark, the occult, demonology, all that kind of fun stuff. I've been studying that for quite a while now. So just been trying to get a lot of information on that, trying to study it as much as I can, trying to get the facts from the fiction. And that's really one of my major things is what is real, what is not real, where does the folklore start, and also the power of the human mind. How much of this stuff, my whole thing about the paranormal is I'm constantly fascinated by the power of the human mind. How much of this is real and where does the mind take over? So I've been researching this probably for about 10 years now. Various and sort of things. I am a recognized demonologist, some things like that. So anyway, just been studying the dark side, getting into that, and really what is going on in the paranormal. So brief description of where I am and where I come from. And one of the things I like about being the demonologist is you've got to have a working knowledge of everything in the paranormal. Because at some point, just about everything is labeled a demon. Whether it be everything from Bigfoot sightings to UFOs, at some point it's all labeled a demon. So if you're into demonology, you've got to have at least a working knowledge of every aspect of the paranormal.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. And Tim?
Tim England. I still enjoy football, barbecue, and hunting ghosts.
Thanks, Tim. Andy?
Andy Kistner here, joined about a couple of years now, I think. And I've been enjoying anything about this, what's going on with our group and what's going on with the paranormal, and it's really been an eye-opener and taught me a lot. So I've been enjoying this and joining in this podcast, see how it goes.
Thanks, Andy. And with us tonight also is one of our teammates, Carrie, here, and she is not feeling well tonight, so she's lurking in the shadows, and she may end up joining us if she can find her voice. So tonight's episode is on the Bell Witch haunting, and we thought it was an interesting case because there seems to be a lot documented on the haunting, so I'm going to kind of let Mark take over, and we're going to have a good discussion tonight on this Bell Witch case.
Okay, well, thank you, Colleen. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I love about the paranormal, especially stories like this, is I like to start with what do we know for sure? What are the facts? And then we'll kind of go from there and get into the haunting aspect, the folklore, the stories, and everything like that. So the Bell Witch story, it begins with a gentleman named John Bell who moves to Adams Station, Tennessee in 1804. So that's where the story begins. Now, sources say he moved to Tennessee from North Carolina, and he moved there in 1804. He proceeded to get a large amount of acreage and become a farmer. I think he said, my research said he had about 320 acres. Now, you stop and think about, you have to keep the timeline in mind here as we go through this. We're talking 1800s, early 1800s. 300 acres had to be a huge chunk of land. You know,
Yeah.
that's a massive farm back in that
Yes.
time. So, John moves to Adams Station, Tennessee. That's northwest of Nashville, about 40 miles. It's about due east of Clarkston, right on the Kentucky border. And the story story, as far as we're concerned, the paranormal activity seems to really pick up around 1817. So it was a few years after John had moved to the area. During that time, one of John's neighbors, a woman by the name of Kate Batts, believed that she was seriously cheated by John in a land deal. And I guess she was quite vocal about being upset about this land deal that happened. So about 1817, reports of paranormal activity start happening on the John Bell farm. And there's multiple reports that people would come from miles around just to experience this. And it is reported that many people had some experience with the entity, whatever it was on the John Bell farm. So that's kind of what we know for sure. There are multiple experiences there. Couple of interesting things I found. The paranormal activity started in 1817. Apparently, John Bell passed away 3 years later in 1820. He died on December 20th of 1820. And interestingly, I found out that Kate, trying to find my notes here, Kate was still alive then.
Huh. So were there rumors that Kate actually may have cursed him, that she was the actual witch?
Well, there's some surfaces to that, that Kate was the actual witch. But again, since Kate outlived John by many years, and I wrote I'm trying to find in my notes here where that is. I'll come back to that. But since Kate outlived him by quite a few years, I'm not really sure I believe that part of the story. There's some other interesting concepts we're going to come up here in a minute. This is such a great story, and it's got everything. It's got a love triangle. Yeah. It's got paranormal activity. It's got a land deal gone bad. Everything you need for a great story. So it's just loaded with all kinds of good stuff. So there's some things around John's death in 1820. We'll probably come back to those here in a few minutes when we get to the other side of it here. But that's what we know. But the paranormal activity seemed to be focused around John Bell Sr., which is where we get the title, the Bell Witch, and his daughter, Betsy. Now, Betsy was not their firstborn, but she was the firstborn after they moved to Tennessee.
Right.
Now, and Betsy's story... Oh, go ahead.
No, pardon me. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, I was going to say, now, Betsy really is kind of interesting part of this story because she wasn't born until after they moved there, and they moved there in 1804. The activity started in 1817. Betsy was not very old by then because she was born after they moved to Tennessee. But it seems that John Bell Sr. and Betsy are the two people that seem to have the most problem with the activity, with the paranormal activity going on there. Yeah. Betsy's story I got very interested in because Betsy, around 1817, 1818, was engaged. Again, she was not very young, but I think around that time, well, she was very young, but I think for society at that time, that was not people got married very young back then.
Yes.
She was engaged to a gentleman named Joshua Gardner, and Joshua and Betsy were engaged, but this is where it's interesting. Joshua and Betsy's old teacher named Professor Richard Powell, and I say old teacher because he was the one who taught them when they were in elementary school, was very interested in Betsy. And Powell was reportedly a student of the occult, ventriloquism, a mathematical genius, and well-versed in horticulture and geology.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets interesting. This is where we get our love triangle. We've got the daughter, Betsy, who is engaged, and their former teacher, Richard Powell, is not happy with the engagement.
Yeah.
And he is reported a student of the occult. Now, who knows what that means?
Right.
especially at that time. I did find out that the entity, a lot of the paranormal activity seemed to really center around Betsy and Joshua. Whenever they tried to be together, the paranormal activity really kicked up.
You have to
Well,
wonder where Professor Powell was during all of this, right?
Exactly.
So it did
Exactly.
center around her, right? Centered
Yes.
around Betsy?
It is centered around Betsy and John. They seem to be the same two. For some reason, well, we can get into that too. But the Bell, which comes from John Bell, who was the father.
Yes. Yeah.
But I guess this activity got so bad whenever Betsy and Joshua tried to be together, she actually called off their engagement in the spring of 1821, which was actually just a few months after John Bell passed away. Remember, John Bell passed away December 1820. Spring, it says on Easter Monday of 1821, Betsy ended her engagement to Joshua Gardner. Yeah. And then some other research found out that Betsy and her former teacher, Richard Powell, did get married in March of 1824.
Well, they did.
Years after she broke. They did, yes. So 3 years after she broke off her engagement to Joshua, she did marry Richard Powell.
That's interesting. And no more mention of the haunting after that.
I could not find anything. The actual haunting that I can see, the activity spiked around 1817. And after that, I just don't get a whole lot. Now, there's a couple of minor references. The entity did promise that it would come back a year later in 1820 after John Sr. died, which it did. Talked to John Jr., and there's stories then that John Jr. Got all kinds of notes and wrote some things down, and the entity shared a lot of information with him, but nobody's been able to find those notes or records.
Right. Yeah, this is an interesting case because the interest in this case obviously is still going on because there's movies made of this even today. Saturday Evening Post had articles on it in 1856 or 49. Sorry, 1849. There was a story about the Bell Witch haunting. So this has been a fascinating case, and it's still pretty relevant in Adams today.
Yeah, today. Nowadays they have caves and everything is supposed to have the Bell Witch in there too. It's a pretty popular tourist destination.
And is it Richard Powell that was? I mean, was there a haunting, or was he using his expertise of ventriloquism to throw his voice? But so if he was doing that as a ventriloquist, it doesn't explain the different entities that the family saw, right? Because they saw a dog and a few other things that were out of place.
Yeah. Now, those are as close as we know as the facts of the case. Now, the legend has, when the 1817, when the activity started, John Sr. was in his corn patch, and he saw a strange animal with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. And he shot at the creature, and the creature just disappeared. And supposedly that was the beginning of the activity. And so where that part of the story comes from, I really have no idea. I don't know anything about that. That is part of the folklore. That's part of the story that comes up in multiple tellings of the story. So.
Do you think it's like an element or something like that? Elemental? Or something crazy like that?
It's skilled in the occult, but again, we don't know. I mean, if somebody played with a deck of cards back then, it could be considered the occult. So we don't really know what that means. But if he was skilled in what we would consider the occult today, not Hollywood version, but the occult today, could he have created this being to be there at the property?
kind of called
Yeah,
it in
see,
type of deal.
that's one of the interesting things about this story. Another part of this that I found, and this is probably where we get the name of the Bell Witch, I found a story that the Reverend James Gunn asked the entity, "Who are you and what do you want?" The answer he got was, "I am nothing but old Kate Bat's witch." And so that is where we get the story of the bell and how Kate Bat tends to be associated with what this thing is. But again, with Kate Bat still being alive, I don't know. Where are we going to go with this? I think there's enough witnesses, enough different accounts here by different people that something was going on.
Because there's a lot of different ways that you could go with this, right? So did Kate Bat put a curse on the family? Did Powell put a curse on Betsy? At the same time, could it have been a collision of different things?
It could have been. Kate and Powell worked together.
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that.
Powell being in love with Betsy, and yet knowing then Kate was very upset with John Sr. for a land deal. Did they have some type of a deal going on?
Interesting.
So there's one angle we can go with it. Another thing is, you got to take the timeline into consideration. This was 1804, very early 1800s. If Kate felt she was wronged in a land deal, but back then for a woman to have property and to sell property was kind of rare.
Right.
So could Powell have done something on his own and then just very easily said, "Oh, it's Kate's witch"? We got to go with the belief at the time and, what people were believing at the time too. So that's why the time frame here tends to play a part of this story.
Well, and a lot of people, and it wasn't just the Bell family that experienced this, because there were hundreds of people that visited the farm in that few years that all of this was going on, and they heard it, or they heard something, right?
Yes.
They heard noises and scratches and all kinds of stuff. I guess if you were really good at setting things up, you could bluff a lot of people. Certainly, probably back in that time frame, you could too.
It's pretty popular back then.
So I don't know, but there's the story that plays into this as well with, was it Andrew Jackson?
Yes, Andrew Jackson believed it and came over.
There's some accounts saying that he did, but there's other accounts saying that he was somewhere else in the country when allegedly Andrew Jackson was supposed to visit the farm. So I'm not sure what to believe there, but it is apparent that people did come and they did experience this haunting and the torment of the family. I mean, the family was being tormented, whether there was a haunting or not, I don't know.
Kind of sounds like a poltergeist type thing to me. I don't think they'd understand about that in those days. People don't even understand about that these days.
So, yeah, there's a lot of angles to this particular story. And the story of Andrew Jackson, the one that I read, is Andrew Jackson was actually in the Nashville, Tennessee area. Again, it was about 40 miles away. And there's some reports that he had a connection to John Jr. So he had a connection to the family. And the report is that Andrew Jackson was actually bringing them provisions. And the reason he was bringing them provisions is because there were so many people coming to the farm to experience this, to witness this entity, that they were actually taking, they were running out of provisions. This is back in the day when somebody came to your farm, the family would put them up for the night and feed them and, send them on their way the next morning. And the family was actually running out of provisions. So I guess Andrew Jackson loaded up a wagon and was headed towards the farm to bring them provisions, supplies, food, and things like that. And on the way there, they're going through a section of very flat land, and all of a sudden the wagon just stops. This wagon full of provisions just stops, and the horses are tugging as hard as they can, and the wagon does not move. and Andrew Jackson orders his men to, take the wheels off the wagon and make sure they're connected to the axle. That seems like a lot of work to me to happen back then, but he took all the wheels off, made sure they were all on the axles, make sure the wheels were okay, they could turn, and yet the dragon would not go forward. And Andrew Jackson, either out of frustration or whatever, finally exclaims, "Well, it's got to be the witch, boys." And from the weeds, they hear a voice saying, "Very good, General, I will visit you again tonight." And the wagon moves on. So, and that was true, I guess, of all the stories that I've heard, the recounts of this situation is that later that night, Andrew Jackson and his men did get a visit from the entity.
They had turned away.
Now,
They weren't at the farm when that happened?
See, now, that part I never got clarified. I think I assumed they kept going to the farm. But I also heard a story then that the wagon only moved when they turned around and went away from the farm.
Okay.
So this is a place where the stories kind of don't line up. We start getting different reports at this stage of the story here.
So in 1868, there was an article published entitled "The Witchcraft and Murder, Hobgoblins and the Old Gray Horses, the Incentive to Crime." And there was this Tom Clinard and Dick Burgess were arrested for the murder of Mr. Smith. And the article reported that Smith claimed powers of witchcraft while working near Adams Station, chopping wood on the farm of the defendants, the Tom Clinard and Dick Burgess. The article stated that Smith claimed to use occult powers on Clinard and Burgess, leading to a conflict between them. The identity of the decedent was reported variously as James or Charles Smith. There was a jury trial, and Clinard and Burgess were returned a not guilty verdict. But there was a published interview with this Lucinda Rawls of Clarksburg, Tennessee, the daughter of, I have no idea how she comes in here, but the daughter of Alexander Gooch and Teenie Thorne, what a name, both reported close friends of Betsy Bell. Rawls testified that the Bell Witch was a frequent topic of conversation during her lifetime and pointed to a murder of a man for witchcraft as evidence for this claim. And she said the Bell Witch was and is still a great scapegoat. Every circumstance out of the regular order of things is attributed to the witch. It has not been long since a man claiming to be the witch was waylaid and murdered by two men who were cleared on the plea that the murdered man had bewitched them. So that's a whole new angle.
Wow.
But that's in,
okay.
Yeah, that's in the authenticated history of the Bell Witch, which is, no one knows how he authenticated the book, right? That was one of the first books ever written. It's called Authenticated, but how he authenticated this, no one knows.
That's interesting.
Well, it's definitely so. There's definitely was a murder, and the guy claimed to be a witch, and it was on this land in this area. So Smith came. Here's more on this guy who was the witch. Smith came into the community a stranger and was employed by Mr. Fletcher, where Clinard and Burgess were also engaged on the farm. Smith professed to be something of a wizard, or rather boasted of his power to hypnotize and lay spells on people, subjecting anyone who came under his influence to his will, and it was reported that he claimed to have derived power from the mantle of the Bell Witch. That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So again, we've got somebody here that does somebody have real skills, or did they manage to read an article somewhere and create a story?
Exactly. Yeah, well, I guess this would have occurred right around the time of the Bell Witch, right? It was just written about 60 years later. That's very interesting.
That is very interesting. So yeah, there's another angle on that too. But then it also comes up for everything that's happened in that area, how much, has been blamed on the witch to various and assorted degrees.
Right.
Well, a lot of things back then was blamed on witches.
Yeah. Again, the time frame has to come into play here. What did people believe at the time? But so, yeah, there could be all kinds of, you could do anything and blame it on the witch back then.
And people were really frightened of anything perceived as paranormal at all. But I do believe that we definitely had we have a haunting, I think. I don't know. This is an interesting one. Do we really have a haunting or not? Or do we have, what are your thoughts,
Well, we have
Mark?
something going on. Again, there were multiple reports of things occurring out there. There were multiple reports of people hearing disembodied voices. And a lot of times the theme kept coming back to it. A lot of times people said they heard a lot of the reports. The theme of what they heard was something that Betsy should not get married to Joshua. That, for whatever reason, that seems to be a theme that is reported consistently through all of the reports. And there's multiple reports of things going on out there too. So we had something happening.
Right.
Well, like with poltergeists and stuff, usually it's that the person projecting themselves for it, and that could be Betsy, like, I don't want to marry this dude.
A lot of stuff was written about this case throughout the next 200 years, right? So, and I was looking at some stuff that even folklorist Tom Pete Cross, who this journal called Studies in Philology. Have you ever heard of that before? Philology? In 1919, published a study of witchcraft in North Carolina by this folklorist, Tom Pete Cross. And Cross cites a column from the Nashville Banner where it mentions the paper had sent a reporter to Robertson County in 1880s and John C. Cook to investigate the possible reemergence of the Bell Witch phenomenon. So even that late, 1880s, the Journal and Studies in 1919 published the study of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
But, 1919, sorry. God, I'm 100 years off here. Okay, so, but wait a minute. So John Bell died in 1820?
1820, correct, yes.
In 1820, but in 1880, they think there was a reemergence of this Bell Witch phenomenon. So that's...
Well, one of the aspects of the Bell Witch story is that the entity does return. It did say it would return after John died in December. It said it would return a year later. And it came back in January, I think, of 1822. So about a year and a month after that, that's when it talked to John Jr. And the entity said it would come back 100 years from now. But there is no documented, nothing to connect that. But the fact that the entity said it would return is one of the repeating themes of the story.
It's really interesting. So do you think this is just like mass hysteria? I mean, that happened with people that were confronted with anything. Look at the Salem witch trials, right? I mean, anything seemed to be hysteria in this day and age. Or do you think something was really going on?
I really think there was something going on. Just because the number of reports that have come down.
Yeah.
The problem is that we're looking at this 200 years later, and they've had 200 years to add to the story, and especially in the paranormal, people are always adding to the story, embellishing, creating, making it more exciting, whatever. And they've been adding onto this for 200 years. So combined with the fact that they actually have, Bell Witch, like a week of festivities in the area in Tennessee once a year. So there's a little bit of a commercial side to this to keep the story going. And I'm not saying these people are doing anything bad or that. It's just that, 200 years later, it's almost impossible to derive fact from folklore.
Mm-hmm.
in a situation like this. So I think something happened just because the number of reports, just because the number of people that reported experiencing something. I don't think it was a witch, though. And I don't think it was the witch of Kate, her specifically.
Interesting.
Now, if she herself, or if she would have worked with Pal to bring up something, to conjure something, that's a possibility.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's the thing.
But it also doesn't act like a witch. So.
Yeah. So in 1886, the Goodspeed brothers published The History of Tennessee and recorded a short occurrence of the legend that identified the spirit of as female and stated that interest in the phenomenon was widespread in the region at that time, and no doubt, right? So what they published says, a remarkable occurrence which attracted widespread interest was connected with the family of John Bell, who settled near what is now Adams Station about 1804. So great was the excitement that people came from hundreds of miles around to witness the manifestations of what was popularly known as the Bell Witch. This witch was supposed to be some spiritual being having the voice and attributes of a woman. It was invisible to the eye, yet it would hold a conversation and even shake hands with certain individuals. The freaks it performed were wonderful, seemingly designed to annoy the family. It would take the sugar from the bowls, spill the milk, take the quilts from the beds, and slap and pinch the children, and then laugh at the discomfiture of its victims. At first, it was supposed to be a good spirit, but its subsequent acts, together with curses, which it supplements its remarks, proved the contrary. A volume might be writing concerning the performances of this wonderful being, as they are now described by contemporaries and their descendants. That all of this actually occurred will not be disputed, nor will a rational explanation be attempted. It is merely introduced as an example of superstition, strong in the minds of all, but a few in those times, and not yet wholly extinct.
One thing I noticed One thing I noticed about this is it was supposed to be a good spirit, good, helpful, talking with people and everything. And these guys never left. They never moved. Nothing scared them away. And over time, it turned into an evil spirit. And I think that's where a lot of the sensationalism over time type of deal, where nothing paranormal can be good. They can be always evil. So I think people over time started equating as evil. Therefore, you have movies like the Blair Witch Project. I looked at all the movies made off this theory, and they're all like horror movies. And it's like, yeah. But mostly, what I've read about it, they haven't been overly ornery or anything like that.
I don't know. What counts is that she actually killed John Bell. So there was a vial of poison found in his home, and no one knows how he got the poison, if he poisoned himself, and then she claimed to have, the witch, have placed the poison in the house for him to take.
And this brings me up to a couple of interesting things. When John passed away, well, he died in 1820. The account is that he was working on his farm, and he was on his way to the pigsty of his farm, and he had some type of illness hit him. After that, he had a very hard time speaking and swallowing. What we know now, the illness that hit him very well could have been a stroke.
Yeah.
But I guess this was about a year before he finally died. So he had a stroke while working on his farm. And then the day that he died, on December 20th, I guess he was on some medications, probably as a result of his stroke. And they went to his medication cabinet the morning he passed away. They went to his medication cabinet, opened it, and there was a strange vial in there that nobody had ever seen before. John Jr. took out the vial, gave a couple of drops to the cat, and it's reported that the cat passed away immediately. Mm-hmm. And upon that time, the entity, whatever was there, did say, claim that they put the vial in the medicine cabinet. And so did that contribute to John's death? Again, we can't directly connect it, but it is part of the. So the entity did come out. Now, interesting part about this entity, when I was doing some research on here, there was a very interesting part of this that I ran across, and that is the entity really seemed to give John Sr. and his daughter Betsy a really bad time. They seemed to be the two that was really focused on the thing. But a lot of accounts say the entity was actually very, very friendly to John's wife, Lucy. And when I first read that struck me as being very strange. But when I was doing some research for this, I actually ran across a genealogy site, and it said that John's wife, Lucy, was actually a sister to Kate's father. So Kate, who was supposedly the witch, was Lucy's niece.
Oh, that's interesting.
So there's another angle in that. We've got a little bit of a family connection going on here, and possibly an explanation for why the entity was always very nice to Lucy.
Wow.
So
I had no
just
idea.
just another angle of this story that just makes it so interesting. You know, this story has so many angles, which is why it is probably why it has stayed alive for 200 years. Probably why we're still talking about it today. There's so many different things to this. And this, you could probably go down this rabbit hole for quite a ways, you know, just finding different connections, different things about this story, different aspects of it, different theories. It's just a wonderful, great story to just wrap around and get into. I would say pretty much, I think there was something going on there. I don't think it was a witch. I don't think it definitely was the spirit or anything of Kate Blatt. But she may have had a part of it. I haven't ruled that out yet. But the one thing that I do know is there was something going on there. And right now, that's really about all I can go with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this was a really good topic for discussion, and I enjoyed some of the research. And for the fans of the podcast, as soon as the podcast is uploaded, then we'll put some of the links to what we found on the Speaking of Spirits page on Facebook, so that you guys can have some links and do some of your own research. And I'm really curious to know what some of the people that listen to the podcast feel about this. And if you are from that area, we'd love to hear from you to see if you've had any stories or experiences or hauntings that you think might fall in line with what happened to the Bell family. Fascinating account. Well, I want to thank Mark and Andy and Tim and for this talk tonight and this podcast of the Bell Witch haunting. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next topic. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Ha 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 ha!